Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. In today's first segment, we're going to discuss the French role in West Africa, specifically in the Sahel region, and especially even more in Mali, where the French role has been criticized to an extent both at home and in African countries. At home, it's about the increasing body count. Recently, we had 13 French soldiers who were killed in a helicopter accident, and two helicopters, I should say, colliding. Since that accident did occur, the French president has asked West African countries to either deal with the growing anti-French sentiment or to clarify for him in a meeting that he's called for in Paris if they do want France to continue having a role in their respective countries. Now, France, you must remember, is a former colonizer of that region. So that, of course, is a huge aspect to all of this as well. Can the former colonial master now come in and provide security and ensure security in that region? Many of these countries still continue to pay taxes, colonial taxes to France, one must remember, although some of them are now moving away from even holding some of their funds in the French central bank. All of those aspects, of course, important to the growing anti-French sentiments, one would imagine, in that region. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're joined now by Emmanuel Dupuy, who is joining us now from Rome. He is the president of the Institute for European Perspective and Security. He is, of course, traveling to Rome, but he's originally based in Paris. Emmanuel, thank you for joining us today. What do you make of Macron's warning to these West African leaders about the anti-French sentiments?
Well, it is not the first time that Emmanuel Macron speaks of that. There's been a huge amount of discontent in regards to the presence of the French forces, not only in Mali, but in the four other neighboring Sahel countries. As you very well know, France is not only engaged throughout its military operation in Mali, but both in Niger, in Burkina Faso, in Chad, and in Mauritania. The French president has been asking and putting pressure on his five African Sahel counterparts for months and months. It's not only about the French presence, it's about the empowerment of the local army, which was the deal that was struck when France decided, at the demand of the Malian authorities, to participate in a counter-terrorist operation in 2013. So I would not say that the French are the only one to be linked to that military presence. You very well know that more than 15,000 UN troops are there as well. And of course, the deal was that the African armies were supposed to be reinforcing themselves. And this is some of the reasons why Emmanuel Macron decided to gather and call for the the leader of the G5 countries to come, not in Paris, but in Pau, which is very symbolic. Pau is the city amongst which 5 of the 13 French soldiers were deployed.
Right, but you know the accusations, of course, against French forces in Mali, for example. It's been said that in African communities, many of the French soldiers actually support corrupt government officials in some of those African countries. And then, of course, there's the other accusation, which Macron says is untrue, and that is that France is there for economic reasons. He says, you know, it's not a neoliberal policy necessarily for France to be there. It's just doing this for collective security. What do you make, though, of those accusations?
This is absolutely exaggerated. First of all, there is no French interest in Mali. If you were to ask the question about Niger, that would be arguable. Of course, 90% of the uranium that we use in the French military plant comes from Niger. But we're not speaking about Niger. We're speaking about Mali, in which France is not a major economical partner. The major economic partner in the region is Germany. Germany has more political interest, and this is why, by the way, 950 soldiers, German soldiers, are present in the MINUSMA operation. So it's quite easy to say that we are here for economical reasons. We are here because we are here for strategic reasons, that's for sure. The security of the area is a matter of preoccupation for us. It's about, of course, the stabilization of the area and the way that we can deal with these countries. And I have to, again, repeat that we did not intervene on our own behalf, but we were asked to do so in January 2013 when there was a risk of a dislocation of the country. under the pressure of the jihadist groups. Now the issue is quite different. We're focusing a lot on Mali, but the question and the issue is not Mali. The question is the weaker states in the area, and we must not forget that Burkina Faso is under huge pressure, maybe the same pressure that Mali was that Mali experienced in 2013. So to respond directly to your question, I would not focus too much on the economical dimension. Just to remind that again, Germany, France, Great Britain, the United States, and of course the African countries by themselves are present in that area.
Do you think at some level, Emmanuel, regardless of just talking about France, but do you think that there are too many hands in this pot? As in, do you think that a lot of these external powers should actually let African countries deal with their own issues?
This is exactly what we're asking, and we've been asking this for almost 5 years. 5 years is the date in which we decided to launch and to help the creation of the G5 Sahel, February 2014. And we've been advocating for, first of all, international sustain. 414 million euros were promised to the international community, our European Union partners, of course, but of course also a great United States, which promised $60 million. And Saudi Arabia, $100 million, and Emirates. The money that all of these countries had promised to give is not there. Only 176 million of euros have been put in this utmost important mission, which is the training, the mentoring, and of course the qualification of the reconstruction of the local armies. Everyone wants that, and first of all, France wants it because France is paying a very hard and very sad tribute. 38 of our French soldiers have been killed since the launching of the operation in January 2013. As I told you, it's not only about economic reasons, it's moreover about strategic reasons. And of course, the issue and the pressure must be put on the countries themselves. But it is not an easy task. As I mentioned, when we intervened, we had a situation in which terrorist groups were located in northern part of Mali. Now they have been migrating. They have committed attack outside of the area in 2016 in Ivory Coast, in 2017, in 2018 in Burkina Faso, and of course on a constant basis in all of this area. So the task is huge. There are only 4,500 soldiers for an area which is as big as Europe. To make a comparison, Mali is almost the size, approximately the size of Afghanistan. We sent 150,000 troops to get rid of the Taliban, and we did not manage to do that between 2001 and 2014.
But certainly you can understand, Emmanuel, I'm sure that, with France's history, and I won't just pick on France, and I'll say Europe's history when it comes to Africa in general, and of course, then if we're talking specifically about the French role in the Sahel region or otherwise as a previous colonial master, many would say that it just, the optics are bad, right? To have the kind of involvement that France has at this point in time, even though, as you've correctly said, of course, the numbers are very low of French involvement in comparison and in context, of course, we're talking about. But nevertheless, I mean, why did France not take all of that into account at this time? I mean, certainly it should have expected that there would be blowback.
Well, again, first of all, we were asked to come. Why were we asked to come? Because the African Union, who had promised to send a 3,000 military corps, did not fulfill its mission. So we were obliged to replace the African Union. That's the first reason. Second reason, we were there because we are the only military force which has the capability of having a very short deployment capability. We decided in one night to do military operation. That's the second point. The third point, we are not only there by ourselves. As I mentioned, we are helped by American intelligence. There's a huge airlift capability offered by our British colleagues. And so it's not only a French operation, and I would not say that the anger of the population is only against the French military operation. The anger is against the international presence. There are 30,000 soldiers, foreign soldiers, deployed in all...
Emmanuel, just because you're running out of time, I'm going to take a bit of extra time. I apologize, but I just had one final thought from you very quickly. Do you think that there's also resentment towards France and other European countries who are involved right now, even including the U.S., I should say, that they may be supporting politicians within Africa, within these countries, who are actually corrupt?
That's another question, and of course, it's not totally linked. It is in accordance, but not totally interacted. These corrupt politicians, if you allow me to call them, were elected by the population themselves. So the problem is not ours. The problem is, why did this population accept that these people were elected? And to be honest, let's not focus too much on Mali, because Burkina Faso got rid of a corrupt politician in October 2014, Blaise Compaoré.
Right.
So and of course, Christian Roch Kaboré is presented as a more, let's say, legitimate leader. The question, I think, could not be raised in Mauritania when the recent election showed that they were more transparent than the previous. So we must just not focus on the question of this leadership. What is true, and I must agree with you, is that when President Macron calls for the 5 presidents to come to Mali, he has an idea behind his head. That is to say that he wants African leaders to say that the French should no longer be. Let me be very clear and very precise. The French are seeking to get out of Mali.
Very well, Emmanuel. We'll leave it there at that. But of course, sincerely appreciate you taking your time out of your busy schedule to share your thoughts with us. That was Emmanuel Dupuy, who was speaking to us from Rome, though he is originally based in Paris. He's the president of the Institute for European Perspective and Security. Now, certainly the role of France in West Africa and just in Africa in general, possibly even around the world, we can argue, is something that is under the spotlight and has come under the spotlight a number of times. With many of these West African countries, the people there are now starting to question why France is there. There is growing anti-French sentiment, with the accusations, of course, that France is there for economic reasons. Our guest disagreeing with those accusations and allegations that have been placed against France at this time. Nevertheless, it seems at least that Macron may be looking for an excuse to leave France, even though, according to our guest again, France was asked to come in by these former colonial colonies, I should say, of France. So one wonders, is this France which wants to get out, or is it the African countries that want France to get out, especially considering the fact that some of these countries have decided to remove their financial reserves from the French central bank? That is an aspect we weren't able to discuss with our guest at this time. We'll, of course, keep a close eye on this, because certainly this is not the last time we'll be hearing about the French role in Africa. I'll be back with my next segment, though, after this break. Stay tuned. Thanks for staying with us, viewers. In this segment of today's program, we're going to discuss U.S. troops in the Middle East. And surprise, surprise, under a Trump administration, there is confusion about what exactly is the Trump policy going forward for the Middle East. Now, Donald Trump on the outside has told us all around the world that he wants to get out of endless wars. But now there are reports, according to the Wall Street Journal originally, that upwards of 14,000 additional troops are to be sent to the Middle East to fight against the perceived Iranian threat, or the growing Iranian threat, according to the WSJ and others. Now, Pentagon officials originally were also confused. We had a Pentagon spokeswoman, I should say, who said that no, that report was completely untrue. Then we had another American official who's saying that no, in fact, we are considering possibly sending additional troops as well as military hardware to the Middle East, again, to counter Iran, though he did not specify the number of troops or exactly how much of the military hardware would be going to the Middle East. Now, a U.S. senator himself has said that he wants to know why 14,000 more troops would be sent to the Middle East after sending 14,000 already this year alone. And he asked then, Senator Josh Hawley, is the Pentagon preparing for a land war? Let's discuss that a bit further. We're joined now by Dr. Lawrence Pintak, who is an author. He's authored America and Islam. He's also advisor to the IBA Center for Excellence in Journalism in Karachi. And he was the founding dean of the Edward R. Murrow College of Communication at Washington State University. He's joining us now from Karachi itself. Lawrence, thank you for your time today. What do you make of this confusion, firstly, about what exactly the Trump policy currently is towards the Middle East?
Well, it's par for the course, isn't it? We hear over and over again that we're going to do this and then we don't, or we aren't going to do this and then we are. What happened in Syria was a classic example of that. So are they or aren't they? Your guess is probably as good as anyone else's.
Do you think, though, that the U.S. should send more troops to the region to counter what it perceives as this growing threat from Iran?
Well, we've seen how effective sending American troops to the Middle East can be. I go all the way back to the U.S. incursion in Lebanon in the early 80s that really sparked the terrorism that we have today. We saw the disaster of Iraq. We've seen it repeated in Syria. So there's no reason to believe that sending troops would actually improve the situation.
But then, as you know, of course, Lawrence, and according to all these reports, it's Israel essentially asked the Americans to send these troops to the region. Do you think, why do you think that is? A, that the Israelis would want there to be more Americans in the region, especially, of course, as Donald Trump made such a big deal out of, quote unquote, pulling troops out of Syria?
Well, it's certainly in Israel's interest to have the U.S. embroiled in any confrontation that they end up in. We see these reports of Iran moving missiles into Iraq, which obviously potentially threatens Israel. They could be moving into Syria, for that matter. We don't know. But if suddenly Israel found itself on the receiving end, having American troops in the region to automatically bolster their position would be in their interest. Now, the question becomes, how effective or what role could American troops actually play? There's certainly an argument that if there was an Iranian overt attack, the presence of American Navy and Air Forces would be a deterrent. But ground troops, we've seen again over and over that ground troops, especially a relatively paltry number like 14,000, would have no real impact.
So do you think at some level, if I may just hone in on the perceived Iranian threat that the Americans feel, the Israelis and even others in the region, do you think that's overblown, overstated to an extent?
Well, I mean, certainly you can't underestimate the potential for Iran causing trouble. Of course, Iran at the moment is in a particularly dangerous position because it has the internal uprising. The regime is on the defensive. The regime blames the U.S. for fomenting this uprising. So elements within that regime could decide that it's in their interest to strike out, to lash out at whether the U.S. or American allies. And obviously the tensions between not only Israel and Iran, but Iran and the Gulf states is very high.
But then at the same time, I mean, I imagine a president like Donald Trump, when he made that pledge, right, when as candidate to that he would get the U.S. out of these endless wars, that he made that pledge because he understood that the American people do not want to be involved in endless wars and endless military interventions overseas. How do you think the U.S. establishment will be able to balance that, if at all?
We come back to the fundamental issue of what is Donald Trump's policies? What is his policy today? What was his policy yesterday? What will his policy be an hour from now? The intelligentsia in Washington, the leadership at the Pentagon, the leadership of the State Department, the leadership of the CIA are unable to ascertain what America's plans are from day to day. So, yes, Trump ran on the policy of getting America out of endless wars, but then his harsh rhetoric toward Iran and toward others certainly puts us in a position where it makes it difficult to back away from potential confrontations. And you saw what happened in Syria. He announced abruptly, without consultation with any of the leadership in Washington, that he was pulling troops out of Syria. American troops and leadership scrambled to respond to that. And then what? A few days later, a few weeks later, it turns out, no, he wants to send more troops in and now we want to guard the oil fields for us. So there is no necessarily any logical rhyme or reason to what the policies are in terms of his belief systems, his core policies, and his desires to placate the electorate.
And one thing, to be fair to Trump, and he has gone back and forth on many other issues, but on the one issue that he did stick by was how much he hated the Iran nuclear deal, right? So when he walked away from that, then that, many people would argue, obviously, was the impetus and was the root cause for the current tensions possibly that we're seeing play out in this region vis-a-vis Iran. Do you think that that was a bad policy?
No. I mean, I think that was a bad decision to pull out. Clearly the deal was not ideal, but it was a deal that had taken a long time of detailed and excruciating negotiations to get it to this point. What has been the result of that, of pulling out of that deal? There's been no positive gains so far, but there's been a lot of downside.
And so then do you think that, obviously Trump keeps saying that we want to negotiate a better deal, in his opinion. Do you think the Iranians will really play ball in that sense?
It's unlikely. Certainly the Iranian, particularly now with the uprising, the leadership can't be seen to be weak in the face of an uprising, and they can't afford to be seen as being weak in the face of American sanctions and rhetoric. So I would, if I were going to put money on the table, I would say no, it's highly unlikely. And at this point also, they're in a waiting game. They see the impeachment issue, they see an election coming in, less than a year now. They can wait it out. They have, obviously, a long timeline.
And then, do you think that war is actually a genuine possibility at this point in time between the U.S. and Iran, or at some level between the U.S. and Iran in this region? Because there have been times where we've thought, okay, now this means war, where, for example, the Iranians downed the American drone, or the alleged Iranian attacks on Saudi oil facilities, et cetera. And there have been so many such instances. I mean, the list is quite long, isn't it? Where we all felt we were at the brink, aren't we? Are we at the brink now, or do you think that it's just grandstanding on the part of both parties?
No, I think it's just saber rattling. If, of course, we don't even know whether this story about 14,000 troops being dispatched is true. As you pointed out in the lead-in, the Pentagon has denied it. Other people in Washington have denied it. So whether it actually plays out, whether it was a trial balloon, who knows? But in any case, even if those troops are sent, you hit the nail on the head. We've been through this before, the downing of the drones, and each time the U.S. has decided not to act. Ostensibly, the president was about to act and then decided not to over the drone issue. Who knows what the truth is there? But it is almost inconceivable for the U.S. to get involved in an all-out confrontation, an all-out military confrontation with Iran. If Iran does something, fires some missiles or something, some punitive airstrike, missile, tit for tat, perhaps. But the idea of an overt war, we saw how disastrous the invasion of Iraq was, and Iran would be Iraq on steroids.
Indeed. Well, we'll leave there as a final comment. But of course, Lawrence, we appreciate you taking your time out of your busy schedule to share your thoughts with us. That was Lawrence Pintak speaking to us from Karachi. Now, viewers, this issue of what the U.S. plan really is for the Middle East is confusing again, as are any other Trump policies around the world. But in the Middle East itself, this can be seen to be especially provocative at a time that there are so many tensions between Iran and even regional countries, and of course the U.S. / even Israel we could talk about. So will the U.S. increase its number of troops in the region, I should say, to counter what it perceives as a growing Iranian threat? That remains an open question, but maybe this is just grandstanding, as Lawrence there said. Maybe it's just the threat of this is meant to deter Iran from any other activities in the region. We'll keep a close eye on that, of course, in this program. I'll be back, though, with my final segment after this break. Stay tuned. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here on Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss threats towards the Muslim Congresswoman in the United States, Ilhan Omar. A second Republican politician has now called for her to be hanged for treason. Now, originally, George Buck said that a staff member had mistakenly sent such an email, but then later backtracked and released a statement saying that he essentially stood by his comments. This came not too long after Danielle Stella, another Republican, had also called for Omar to be hanged for treason, and this was done on Twitter. She's now been banned from Twitter, and she had originally put up a picture as well of a stick figure hanging from the gallows as well. This is not the first time, certainly, that Congresswoman Omar has been threatened. She's been receiving a lot of threats, especially since Donald Trump called her out. And of course, this goes to show essentially that the atmosphere within the United States, especially in a Trump presidency, has become that much more negative, especially towards who are called the Squad, so including the likes of Representatives Omar and Rashida Tlaib and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and others, of course, who are also, of course, and have been receiving threats and have been at the receiving end of very negative tweets from the president also. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're joined now by Maryam Sarhan, who is a researcher of international studies and diplomacy at the University of London SOAS. She's joining us now from Washington, D.C. Also joining us from Washington, D.C. is Arsalan Iftikhar, who is a prominent human rights lawyer, founder of themuslimguy.com and senior research fellow for the Bridge Initiative at Georgetown University in D.C. Arsalan and Maryam, good morning to you both. Arsalan, let me start with you. What do you make of these threats towards Representative Omar?
Well, Waqar, sadly, I'm not surprised by these threats. I mean, in many ways, Islamophobia has now become normalized within the Republican Party and other right-wing circles in the United States today. And it started over a decade ago with the election of a black man named Barack Hussein Obama. If you remember, during the time that Barack Obama was running for president, there was a famous birther controversy where Donald Trump had publicly stated that he wasn't even sure if Barack was born in the United States and maybe he was a Muslim. And the fact that these whisper campaigns of Barack being some sort of crypto-Muslim Manchurian candidate were so pervasive that even today in the year 2019, nearly 30% of Republican voters still believe that Barack Obama is a Muslim today. And so being Muslim within the political sphere here in the United States has become a slur. And because of that, Ilhan Omar, in many ways, the Islamophobia against her is racialized in many different ways. It's rooted in anti-blackness and anti-woman and anti-Muslim rhetoric and anti-refugee and anti-immigrant sentiment. And so there's a multi-layers there. And so sadly, we've seen Islamophobia become normalized within American politics today. And that's why we're seeing a lot of the attacks that we see today against Congresswomen Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar.
Right. So Maryam, what do you make of Islamophobia that's directed towards these women, especially, of course, Representatives Omar and Tlaib?
Well, Waqar, I think what we're seeing is all of Congresswoman Ilhan Omar's identities being attacked. She represents an immigrant, she's a refugee, she's a Muslim, but she's also a Muslim woman who wears the hijab, which is a visible symbol of her identity. And the vitriol that we've seen come out of, following her during her election, after her election, and now as she serves really symbolizes the darkest underbelly of American politics, where it's become unfiltered and everyone has not kept in mind that not all speech is free speech, and there are limits. And the Constitution and the Supreme Court cases have illustrated that. And so my hope is that with time, people will change, and that we just have to continue fighting back and hope that we use the rights of freedom of speech that we have to counter the hate speech.
Indeed. Arsalan, one of the disturbing, as you alluded to, of course, as well, is that this sort of Islamophobia and this sort of rhetoric, calling for somebody to be hanged for treason, that's taking it quite a step far, isn't it? Where this sort of rhetoric is sort of just being accepted. I imagine, and I don't want to make a comparison to other groups of people because one would not want anyone to be targeted in this fashion, but if it was any other group, you would imagine that there would be a lot more uproar.
Yeah, you're right, Waqar. I think, people have become emboldened within the Republican Party because of all of the Islamophobia coming from the commander-in-chief, Donald Trump. Let's not forget that Donald Trump has a long history of Islamophobia. He once famously told CNN news anchor Anderson Cooper that, quote, "I think Islam hates us." He's called for the surveillance of American mosques. Again, he has, alluded to former President Obama being a Muslim. He has talked about, Muslims being enemies of the United States. And so, when the commander-in-chief and the leader of the Republican Party today is saying such unabashed Islamophobic statements, then you can probably imagine that other members of the Republican Party would then become emboldened to say these sorts of things. Now, of course, the Republican National Committee has obviously disavowed, these obnoxious threats against Ilhan Omar's life. But again, it just goes to show that even though these are sort of fringe candidates, at the state and local levels, who are making these statements, that again, they feel emboldened in ways because Islamophobia has become normalized. You're absolutely right that if they were talking about any other minority demographic group in America today, they would rightfully be laughed out of any room. But again, because Islamophobia has become normalized, because anti-Muslim sentiment is accepted in mainstream America today, you don't see that same sort of pushback against Islamophobia.
And then, Maryam, there is, if we talk politics for a moment, there is then the issue of course, these women and them talking about Palestine, for example, right, and what's happening in the occupied territories, and that even Nancy Pelosi didn't support any of their, speeches about that and any of their stances on that issue as well, and being critical of Israel. What do you make of that?
I think that's the current political climate where it's very taboo to bring up the issue of Israel and how it acts as a quote unquote democratic state. That of course I don't think has come to any surprise for anyone, as that's always been a very sensitive topic in American politics. But I hope that with time we are able to have more open conversations that need to be said.
And do you think in some ways, and Maryam, that these sorts of attacks on Ilhan Omar and even Rashida Tlaib at that time, of course, especially when that news at first came out, that this was sort of to be expected, where there would then be this outpouring of negativity towards them for even daring to break that taboo?
Absolutely. I think both congresswomen knew that there would be, some pushback, criticism. I believe that they're very intentional with how they use the privileges that they have and the power that people have entrusted with them to speak on their behalf. And I believe that they do have that in mind, indeed.
Arsalan, what do you make of that, of these women speaking out about Palestine?
I mean, I think that's just one small layer in this, entire debate. Again, I think that a lot of this, rhetoric that we're seeing today is coming because of the normalization of Islamophobia. I mean, there are a number of members of Congress now who are starting to speak out on the human rights issues related to the Palestinians. But again, I think that, when you have the first two American Muslim women elected to Congress. I mean, these were historically elected women. These were pioneers. They were firsts.
Let me go to you, Maryam, with the next question about this issue, because if we're looking going forward then, and with Ilhan Omar having the kinds of threats against her life that she now has, do you think the Democrat Party is actually willing to stand by her continually? Nancy Pelosi has spoken about, having further security, and I believe more security has been provided to the Congresswoman. But do you think that the party that she is part of is willing to stand by her to the end?
I believe you are indeed correct about Majority Leader Pelosi stepping up security to ensure Congresswoman Ilhan's safety. And unfortunately, it is a reality for many elected officials, but even more so for those who stand out, like Representative Omar and Rashida Tlaib. So I think it's an unfortunate reality that when you do when you are in the public eye, that you do face things like that. And it's absolutely horrendous and it's unforgivable. But it's, in terms of the Democratic Party, I think that parts of the party are standing behind Omar, but I still believe that there's a good amount of people who don't want to talk about the controversial subjects. They want to stay clear of them. So we'll see with the next election how the tides will turn, or if they'll be the same.
If I may push you on that point, Arsalan, that you're making, that about this mainly being about Islamophobia, because I would argue at some level that, Arsalan, that they may have touched a nerve by talking about Palestine as openly as they did. I mean, do you not think at some level that the moment these two women broached that topic as openly as they did, that was essentially the root cause and the outpouring of negativity that we saw from then on?
Well, what I was saying, Waqar, is that Ilhan and Rashid are not the first two people to talk about the Israeli-Palestinian issue. In the neighboring district from Ilhan, longtime Congresswoman Betty McCollum has spoken out very vocally for Palestinians and Palestinian human rights for decades. Again, what I'm getting at is because these were two pioneering American Muslim women who were elected into the halls of Congress, they had a political bullseye on their back. And so anything that they would say would then be amplified again because of their Muslimness. And in the case of Ilhan, the case of her Blackness, in the case of her being a refugee, in the case of wearing her hijab, being an immigrant, all these things amplified these things. And so I'm not saying that it's not a part of the equation at all, but I think that it would be slightly disingenuous to say that is exactly the focal point. Again, I think it is their Muslimness. I think it is their Islamic identity that is central to the attacks that we're seeing here today, and why we're not seeing a lot of pushback against that.
And then, Arsalan, I'm not sure, but I'm sure you may have seen this reporting by The Guardian, which just came out recently, about an investigation that they've carried out about how a shadowy Israeli group has been encouraging and been carrying out a targeted campaign, a sustained campaign of far-right hate and lies overall online, and especially through Facebook, right-wing groups on Facebook, but also targeting the likes of Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib. What do you make of such a sustained campaign against these women and of Islamophobia?
Yeah, I think it speaks to the era of fake news that we live in today. Obviously we saw the Russian disinformation campaign here in the United States, but still continues until today. But again, I think that these players are, again, they're capitalizing on this Islamophobia, and then they know the fact that because of past statements that these congresswomen have made on the Israeli-Palestinian issue have been deemed controversial, have been amplified again because of their own identities. They're capitalizing on that, and that's why they're disseminating this fake information, to over 1 million people on Facebook, and that's why it's essential that Facebook needs to monitor and ban fake news altogether, and not hide behind the guise of free speech like Mark Zuckerberg has done in the past.
Indeed, on that point then, Maryam, what are your thoughts about those Facebook groups that are so right-wing and that spread malicious lies really about, be it Representatives Omar or Tlaib, or even otherwise just Muslims in general in the United States? I mean, that feeds into this very negative atmosphere, doesn't it?
It certainly does. And I think we have guidelines that we're able to use from the Constitution, specifically the First Amendment and how it's been interpreted over the years here in the American courts. And, whether it's hate speech, obscenity, certain areas that have limits, I think is what we need to go by, because unfortunately, I think it's going to be very difficult to try to monitor speech that we may not like. If it's in an area that is not protected speech, I think we'll be able to achieve that. But I think the reason Facebook has had success not being pushed in that direction is because it's well aware of that.
All right, I'll get a final comment then from Arsalan before let's go. Arsalan, one of the things that has spoken of very regularly when it comes to Muslims in influential positions in the U.S. is, can they really be patriotic Americans? And as a Muslim yourself, how do you answer that question?
I think it's as ridiculous as asking, can any group of people be patriotic Americans? I mean, America is an immigrant nation. We are a history of immigrants. Muslims have been here in the United States since its very founding, when African Muslim slaves were brought over on slave ships over 400 years ago. Many historians say that 20 to 30% of slaves brought over were Muslims. We have fought in every single war that the United States has fought in. We have served in Congress. We have represented the United States in professional sports. We are 1% of the population, but we represent 10% of doctors, according to some studies. So again, we're as part and parcel of American society as any other demographic group. And again, to insinuate that Muslims are not as patriotic as other people is rooted in Islamophobia. It again is it's part of that dual loyalty smear that Muslims and Jewish people and many other minority groups have faced here in the United States since its inception. And so again, we have to understand that when we're dealing with issues related to xenophobia, racism, and politics, again, there are double standards that come into play when you're dealing with people of minority backgrounds, both racially and religiously as well.
Very well. We'll leave it there at that. But of course, we appreciate both Arsalan and Maryam for their time this morning and, of course, for their insight. Viewers, this question of how Congresswoman Ilhan Omar is being treated, as well as Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib and the others as well, who are part of what's called the squad, it's disturbing, isn't it? But especially with the Congresswoman now being threatened with treason and to be hanged, and et cetera, and that seemingly being accepted by the mainstream at some level, though there has been, muted condemnations of such calls by Republicans. At some level, even the Democrat Party is seemingly okay with these sorts of threats, especially since these women also broached the topic of Israel-Palestine and what's been happening in the occupied territories and spoke about it fairly openly at that time as well. Then we've had Donald Trump, the commander-in-chief, who's also spoken very negatively about these congresswomen and has called for them to be removed from their respective positions, etc. All of that is very disturbing. And again, it goes back to, as Arsalan there said, the root of all this is Islamophobia, because the questioning of one's patriotism towards one country, even as an immigrant, comes from Islamophobia, because there's that perceived notion that a Muslim cannot be patriotic because they have dual loyalty somewhere else. We'll certainly keep a very close eye on this, but it is a disturbing trend, certainly, that is coming out of the United States. I'll leave it there for now, though. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.